When we talk about World War II, we're usually handed a story that's already been decided for us. There were the good guys and the bad guys. There were clear lines. There were heroes and monsters. And when it ended, justice was served. That's the version we grew up with. That's the version that made it into textbooks and memorial speeches and Hollywood films. But the actual war, the one that took place in bunkers and offices and locked filing cabinets, was far more complicated than that. Not because the atrocities weren't real. They were. But because the people who enabled them, who participated in them, who looked the other way, weren't always the ones we expected. And the systems that made those atrocities possible didn't disappear when the guns went silent. They were absorbed, rebranded, quietly filed away. This isn't about revising history. It's about reading the parts that were left out on purpose, the documents that were sealed, the testimonies that were ignored, the practices that were too embarrassing or too useful to talk about. What follows are 19 facts about World War II that were systematically removed, downplayed, or buried in archives that most people will never see. Not because they're conspiracy theories, but because they complicate the story we were told. And complication doesn't sell war bonds. The first thing you need to understand is that Nazi Germany didn't invent the concentration camp. Britain used them during the Boer War. Spain used them in Cuba. The United States used them for Japanese Americans. The term itself was sanitized language for what were essentially detention centers where people died from neglect, disease, and deliberate cruelty. What made the Nazi camps different wasn't the concept. It was the scale and the bureaucratic efficiency. But that efficiency didn't come from nowhere. It came from studying how other nations managed populations they considered undesirable. German officials visited American Indian reservations in the 1930s. They took notes. They studied racial laws in the United States, particularly the ones that defined who could marry whom and who could own property. They admired the clarity, the legal precision, the way America had managed to strip rights from entire groups of people without calling it extermination. They wanted that same kind of structure, and they got it. But after the war, nobody wanted to talk about where the blueprints came from. It was easier to present the camps as a uniquely German evil than to admit that the architecture of oppression had been internationally sourced. Medical experiments in the camps are well known. What's less known is that after the war, the United States and the Soviet Union both quietly recruited the doctors who performed them. Not all of them, but enough. Operation Paperclip is the famous one, the program that brought Nazi scientists to America to work on rockets and missiles. But it didn't stop at rocket scientists. It included doctors who had frozen people to death to study hypothermia, doctors who had tested nerve agents on prisoners, doctors who had performed surgeries without anesthesia to observe pain tolerance. The justification was always the same. We need their knowledge. The Soviets will get them if we don't. National security, the Cold War, the greater good. So these men were given new identities, new jobs, and in some cases, pensions. Their crimes were classified. Their research was integrated into military programs. And the victims were never consulted. There was no trial for most of them. There was no reckoning. There was paperwork. There were contracts. There were security clearances. And then there was silence. The bombing of Dresden is often held up as an example of Allied excess. A city full of refugees incinerated in firestorms that served no clear military purpose. But Dresden wasn't unique. It was part of a broader strategy. The British Air Marshal Arthur Harris believed in area bombing. The idea was simple. You don't just hit factories and railroads. You hit homes. You hit schools. You hit hospitals. You create so much civilian suffering that the population demands surrender. The term used internally was dehousing. The goal was to make people homeless, to break morale by breaking bodies. Churchill supported it. Roosevelt didn't object. And it worked, in the sense that German cities burned. But after the war, Harris was never prosecuted. He was never censured. He wasn't invited to certain ceremonies, which was the extent of his punishment. The strategy itself was quietly retired from official doctrine, but the precedent remained. Civilians were no longer off-limits. The line between combatant and non-combatant had been erased, and it would stay erased in every war that followed. The Allied forces liberated concentration camps, and the photographs from those liberations are some of the most searing images of the 20th century. But what happened immediately after liberation is rarely discussed. Thousands of survivors died in the weeks and months following their release. Some from disease, some from refeeding syndrome, which happens when starving people are given too much food too quickly and their bodies shut down. Some from neglect. The Allied command wasn't prepared for what they found. There were no plans for mass medical care, no infrastructure for displaced persons. So survivors were often kept in the same camps they'd just been freed from, sometimes guarded by the same local police who had worked under the Nazis. They weren't prisoners anymore technically, but they weren't free either. They were reclassified as displaced persons, which meant they had no country, no rights, no clear path forward. Some stayed in those camps for years, and while the liberators were celebrated, the people they liberated were largely forgotten until it became politically useful to remember them. The Nuremberg trials are taught as a turning point in international justice, and in some ways they were, but they were also deeply selective. The trials focused on the leadership, the planners, the men who gave orders. What they didn't focus on were the thousands of people who carried out those orders, the bureaucrats who processed deportation papers, the train conductors who knew where the tracks led, the factory owners who used slave labor and paid the SS for the privilege, the bankers who managed stolen assets. Most of them were never charged. Many of them returned to their jobs after a brief period of denazification, which was itself a compromised process. You filled out a questionnaire. You claimed you were just following orders or that you didn't know. And unless someone could prove you personally killed someone, you were often cleared. By the early 1950s, West Germany needed functional institutions, and that meant bringing back people who knew how to run things. So they did. Judges who had sentenced people to death under Nazi law returned to the bench. Police officers who had rounded up Jews returned to their beats. And the systems they had served were rebranded as democratic. The Soviet Union lost more people in World War II than any other nation. Estimates range from 20 to 27 million dead. But those deaths weren't all caused by the Germans. Stalin's own policies killed millions of his own citizens before the war even started. And during the war, his strategies were brutal by design. Soldiers were sent into battle without adequate weapons and told to pick up rifles from the dead. Retreating without orders was punishable by execution. Barrier troops were positioned behind the front lines with orders to shoot anyone who fled. Entire ethnic groups were deported from their homelands on suspicion of collaboration. The Chechens, the Crimean Tatars, the Volga Germans. They were loaded onto trains and sent to Central Asia with no food, no shelter, no explanation. Thousands died in transit. This wasn't hidden from the Allies. They knew. But the Soviet Union was a necessary partner, so the atrocities were downplayed. After the war, Stalin was never held accountable. He was celebrated as the man who defeated Hitler, and the millions who died under his command were folded into the larger narrative of Soviet sacrifice, as if the cause of death didn't matter. The United States interned over 100,000 Japanese Americans during the war. Most of them were citizens. They were given days to sell their homes, their businesses, everything they owned. They were sent to camps in remote desert areas surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. They weren't accused of crimes. They weren't given trials. They were imprisoned because of their ancestry. The government called it evacuation and relocation, which made it sound voluntary. It wasn't. Families were split up. People died from inadequate medical care. And while they were locked up, white neighbors bought their property for pennies on the dollar. After the war, there was no apology. Not for decades. The camps were closed, the people were released, and the country moved on. It wasn't until 1988 that the US government formally apologized and paid reparations, and even then, the amount was a fraction of what had been lost. But the legal framework that allowed it, the idea that the government can suspend rights during an emergency, that framework was never dismantled. It's still there. When the Allies invaded Germany, they encountered millions of displaced people. Former prisoners, former slave laborers, refugees, and among them were thousands of women who had been raped by German soldiers during the occupation of Eastern Europe. But those women weren't the only ones. Soviet soldiers raped an estimated 2 million German women as they advanced through Prussia and into Berlin. It was systematic, it was widespread, and it was rarely punished. The Red Army treated it as spoils of war. Some commanders encouraged it, some ignored it. A few tried to stop it, but enforcement was inconsistent. The women who survived carried the trauma in silence. Many became pregnant. Many were abandoned by their families, who saw them as contaminated. After the war, this was not discussed in any official capacity. The Soviets didn't acknowledge it. The Germans couldn't talk about it without seeming to deflect from their own crimes. And the Western allies didn't want to alienate their Soviet partners. So it was buried. The women were expected to move on, to rebuild, to forget, and for the most part, history forgot with them. The Holocaust is rightly remembered as the central atrocity of the war, but it wasn't the only genocide. The Nazis killed 6 million Jews. They also killed millions of others: Soviet prisoners of war, Poles, Romani people, disabled individuals, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, political dissidents. The camps weren't just for Jews, though Jews were the primary target. But after the war, the focus narrowed. The Jewish experience became the defining narrative of Nazi evil, which was appropriate given the scale and intent. But it also meant that other victims were sidelined. The Romani genocide, the Porajmos, killed as many as 500,000 people. It's barely mentioned in most history courses. Soviet POWs were deliberately starved in camps that were designed to kill them. Over 3 million died. But because they were enemy soldiers, their deaths were filed under war casualties, not genocide. The disabled were among the first victims of Nazi extermination programs, gassed in mental institutions as part of a campaign the Nazis called euthanasia. But that program was rarely highlighted after the war because it implicated doctors and medical institutions that continued to operate. The categories of victim mattered. Some were memorialized, others were footnotes. The Allies knew about the death camps long before they liberated them. Intelligence reports, eyewitness testimonies from escapees, reconnaissance photographs. By 1942, the BBC was broadcasting reports about mass killings. The Polish government in exile was sending detailed information, but the response was muted. The official position was that the best way to help the victims was to win the war as quickly as possible. Bombing the rail lines to Auschwitz was considered and rejected multiple times. The stated reason was that it would divert resources from military targets. The unstated reason was that Jewish refugees were not a priority. There was also the question of what to do with survivors if they were freed. Britain had restricted Jewish immigration to Palestine. The United States had strict quotas. No one wanted an influx of displaced Jews, so there was little incentive to act. The camps continued to operate, the trains continued to run, and the killing continued at industrial scale. After the war, this reluctance was reframed as a failure of imagination. People claimed they didn't understand what was happening, that the reports seemed too extreme to believe. But the reports were clear. The choice was not to act. The Marshall Plan is celebrated as an act of American generosity that rebuilt Europe. And it did. But it also served American interests. Europe was devastated. The Soviet Union was expanding. If Western Europe collapsed economically, it would likely turn communist. The United States needed markets for its goods and allies for the Cold War. So the Marshall Plan wasn't charity, it was strategy. And it came with conditions. Countries that accepted aid had to open their markets to American products. They had to align politically with the United States. They had to purge communist elements from their governments. This wasn't secret. It was explicit policy. But the framing was always humanitarian. We're helping you rebuild. We're saving you from tyranny. And that framing worked because people needed help. They needed food and medicine and infrastructure. But the debt, political and economic, lasted for decades. Europe was rebuilt. But it was rebuilt in America's image and for America's benefit. And any country that resisted, that tried to chart an independent course, found its aid reduced or cut off entirely. The Katyn massacre was the execution of 22,000 Polish officers and intellectuals by the Soviet secret police in 1940. For years, the Soviet Union blamed the killings on the Nazis. The Western allies, who needed Soviet cooperation, didn't push back. Even after evidence surfaced that pointed to Soviet responsibility, the official line remained ambiguous. It wasn't until 1990, after the Soviet Union had collapsed, that Russia admitted responsibility. But during the war and for decades after, the truth was suppressed. The Polish government in exile knew, Polish families knew, but they were told to stay quiet. Raising the issue would harm Allied unity. It would give ammunition to Nazi propaganda. So the dead were left in mass graves and their killers were never prosecuted. The massacre was treated as a footnote, an unfortunate incident, not a war crime. And the lesson was clear. Justice depended on politics. If it was inconvenient to acknowledge a crime, it would be ignored. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed more people in a single night than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Estimates range from 80,000 to 100,000 dead. The city was made of wood and paper. The bombs were designed to create firestorms. Entire neighborhoods were incinerated. People suffocated in bomb shelters as the fires consumed all the oxygen. The canals filled with bodies. It was deliberate. It was planned. And it was considered a success by the military command. General Curtis LeMay, who oversaw the bombing campaign, later said that if the United States had lost the war, he would have been tried as a war criminal. But the United States won. So he was promoted. The firebombing campaign continued. 66 other Japanese cities were targeted. By the time the atomic bombs were dropped, Japan's urban infrastructure had already been destroyed. The nuclear attacks are remembered because of the technology, because of the implications. But the conventional bombing campaign was just as deadly and in some ways more cruel, because it was repetitive, night after night, city after city, and it's rarely discussed with the same moral scrutiny. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki are often justified as necessary to end the war and avoid a costly invasion. But that narrative has been contested by historians for decades. Japan was already on the verge of collapse. Its navy was destroyed. Its cities were in ruins. The Soviet Union was about to invade Manchuria, which would have cut off Japan's last remaining resources. Some military leaders, including General Eisenhower, believed Japan would surrender without the bombs. But the decision was made anyway. There were multiple reasons: to test the weapon, to justify the cost of the Manhattan Project, to send a message to the Soviet Union about American power, to end the war before the Soviets could demand a role in the post-war settlement. The bombs were dropped. 2 cities were obliterated. Over 200,000 people died, most of them civilians, and the official story became that it saved lives, that it was a mercy, that it prevented 1 million American casualties, a number that was never supported by the military's own estimates. But the story stuck, and the decision was never seriously questioned in American discourse, because to question it would be to admit that the bombs were not a tragic necessity, but a choice. After the war, the United States granted immunity to Japanese scientists who had conducted biological warfare experiments on Chinese civilians and prisoners of war. Unit 731, based in Manchuria, infected people with plague, cholera, and anthrax. They performed vivisections without anesthesia. They tested frostbite by freezing limbs and then thawing them to see what would happen. Thousands of people were killed in these experiments. When the war ended, the Soviet Union captured some of the researchers and tried them. But the United States cut a deal with the commander, Shiro Ishii, and his top staff. In exchange for their data, they were given immunity from prosecution. The reasoning was the same as with the Nazi doctors. The research was valuable. The Soviets couldn't be allowed to have it exclusively, so the data was classified, the men were never charged, and the victims were erased from the official record. Japan never acknowledged the unit's existence until decades later, and even then the acknowledgement was vague. There were no reparations, no apologies. The experiments were treated as a footnote, and the scientists lived out their lives in peace. The Allies divided Germany after the war. The Western zones became West Germany, and the Soviet zone became East Germany. But the division wasn't just political. It was also a matter of resources. The Soviet Union stripped entire factories from East Germany and shipped them back to Russia as reparations. Machinery, rail lines, even plumbing. Anything that could be moved was taken. The stated reason was that Germany owed a debt for the destruction it had caused. And it did. But the result was that East Germany was left economically crippled, while West Germany, which received Marshall Plan aid, rebuilt quickly. The division was presented as ideological, capitalism versus communism. But it was also punitive. The Soviets wanted to ensure that Germany could never threaten them again. So they took everything that wasn't nailed down. And when the East German economy collapsed decades later, the narrative was that communism failed. But the system had been gutted before it even started. The Nuremberg Principles established that following orders is not a defense for war crimes, but that principle was selectively applied. It was used to prosecute Nazi officials, but it wasn't used to prosecute Allied soldiers who committed atrocities. American troops executed German prisoners at Dachau after liberation. Canadian troops were known to shoot surrendering German soldiers rather than take them prisoner. Soviet forces executed German officers routinely. These were war crimes by the standards established at Nuremberg, but they were never prosecuted. The justification was always context. The Germans started it. They deserved it. It was the heat of battle. And maybe that's true. War makes people do things they wouldn't otherwise do. But the law was supposed to apply universally. That was the point of Nuremberg, that there are lines you don't cross, no matter who you are. But in practice, the lines only applied to the losers. The winners wrote the rules and then exempted themselves. At the end of the war, millions of Germans were expelled from Eastern Europe, from Poland, from Czechoslovakia, from Hungary, from Romania. They were given hours to pack. They were marched to trains. Many died on the journey from cold, from hunger, from violence. Estimates of the dead range from 500,000 to 2 million. It was ethnic cleansing, by definition. The stated reason was that these populations had supported Hitler, that they had enabled the occupation, and that their removal was necessary for future peace. The Allies approved the expulsions at Potsdam. It was official policy. But the suffering was immense. Families were torn apart. Old people died on the side of the road. Children were separated from their parents. And after it was over, it was barely mentioned. The focus was on rebuilding, on moving forward. The expellees were resettled in Germany and told to integrate. Their trauma was considered less important than the crimes Germany had committed. And maybe that's fair, in a cosmic sense. But it also meant that an entire category of suffering was dismissed, and the idea that collective punishment is acceptable was embedded in post-war policy. The United Nations was created in the aftermath of the war to prevent future conflicts, but its structure ensured that the victors would remain in control. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China, were given veto power over any resolution. This meant that any action against their interests could be blocked. It was a system designed to maintain the post-war order, not to deliver justice. And it worked. The UN prevented some conflicts, but it also stood by during others. It couldn't intervene when the permanent members or their allies were involved. The result was a global institution that could only act when it was convenient for the powerful. The rhetoric was about peace and human rights. The structure was about control, and that disconnect has defined international relations ever since. By the time the war ended, over 60 million people were dead. The infrastructure of entire countries had been destroyed. The Holocaust had revealed the capacity for industrialized murder. The atomic bomb had introduced the possibility of human extinction, and the systems that enabled all of it, the bureaucracies, the legal frameworks, the hierarchies of obedience, those systems didn't disappear. They were adapted. The officers became diplomats. The scientists became consultants. The factories retooled for peacetime production. The files were sealed. The trials concluded, and the world moved on. Not because the problems were solved, but because solving them would have required dismantling structures that the victors still needed. So the war ended. The killing stopped, and the mechanisms that made it possible were quietly preserved for future use.